The committee's decision to lower the monetary policy rate was predicated on the sustained disinflation recorded in the past 5 months, projections of declining inflation for the rest of 2025, and the need to support economic recovery efforts.
The message is clear. The CBN.
Well, many thanks indeed for staying with us here on the program. This is the morning brief. Let's get to take a look at Nigeria's economy now. Bukola, you have this one.
Yes, indeed. And Mr. Kelvin Emmanuel, Economist, joins us from our Abuja studio. Good morning, Mr. Emmanuel. Thank you for joining us on the program. Or he joins us virtually. Mr. Emmanuel, welcome to the morning brief.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here, Bukola.
Yes,
Good
indeed.
morning.
So after 5 months of consecutive inflation decline, and of course we also recall what many analysts described as hawkish approach to tightening interest rate, we finally see a reduction. Were you surprised by this reduction?
Bukola, it's quite an interesting conversation, and I'm not obligated to be politically correct because I'm not holding a brief for the Nigerian government. I'll say it as it is. The first question we should ask is inflation actually where it is, where the MBS claims it is today? Is the MBS, under undue political pressure and interference from the government? Are they moves in National Assembly to make the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics financially autonomous, so their funding does not come from directly from the government, and they are not subjected to political leverage? Because one thing you should never joke with is statistics. One thing a government should never joke with is statistics. So for example, CBN operates what they call inflation targeting, which means that there's what they call yield curve differential, your interest to inflation yield curve. And by that targeting, it means that you constantly have to place the interest rates, the monetary policy rates, which is being reduced to 27% from 27.5%. By 50 basis points to the inflation level by around 4%, which was the reason why before this questionable rebasing exercise that was done with the 2019 calendar year by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, they targeted inflation at 32% to 27.5%, which means that as the inflation level, for example, reduces, the CBN is obligated to reduce the interest rates, right? So the question is, if, for example, the CBN is targeting inflation at 4%, which means that the MPR is supposed to be anywhere around 4 to 5% lower than the inflation level, and then according to the government, inflation is a little below 21% currently. Why is the CBN not cutting interest rates drastically by maybe 500 basis points, 5%, down to like 22%, 22.5%, or even below 20%? Why are they cutting just by 50 basis points? That's a question we should ask. And they're doing that because the monetary policy, the monetary policy committee, the MPC, which is made up of about 11 or 12 members, they have what they call the Monetary Policy Technical Committee and Monetary Policy Implementation Committee. Those ones are tasked with, guiding the Monetary Policy Committee, putting all the data available for them to make decision on all these metrics, asymmetric corridor, monetary policy rates, cash reserve ratio. Cash reserve ratio was maintained at 50%, but the non-TSA public sector CRR, cash reserve ratio, which is the public sector funds that are outside of the Treasury single accounts. For example, you remember when 24 months ago, Wike became the minister of the FCT. He had gone to the government, the president, and said he wanted the FCT to be moved out of the TSA, and they granted him that request. So the funds for the FCT, for example, are outside of the TSA. And what Cardozo has done is he's jacked that to 75%, which means that 75% of public sector monies that are outside of Treasury single accounts are to be parked at the Central Bank of Nigeria. I don't know if they are currently applying an interest on cash reserve ratio. So the point is, the first question we have to ask, we have to question the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. Are they independent? Are they truly independent, or are they under undue political pressure? Because when you look at the rebasing of inflation, and you see how they grouped energy and housing and water into one basket and said it's just 15.8%, when prior to that, energy was taking 20% of the cost price index basket for calculating inflation, then it becomes very questionable. They reduce food from 60% to 50.8%, yet food inflation remains one of the biggest problems we have today in Nigeria.
But Mr. Emmanuel, one of the things that may not be under the influence, or if you like, the whims and caprices of the NBS, would be the price of food. And we have seen that in the last couple of weeks reduce. And we have, in fact, confirmed this from the food sellers right here on the program. How much of this are you factoring into your analysis?
Well, you've confirmed that, but then the question is, what's the critical mass of Nigerians that you've confirmed from? Because prices of food varies in different parts of Nigeria, and that's why you have what they call the headline rate, because you basically put the prices across several states in Nigeria, all the states in Nigeria. You get the aggregate, and then you divide it by the number of states. That's how you get the headline inflation rate. And that's how you also get the headline food inflation rate. So the question is, you ask people, for example, in Lagos, or for example, in Abuja, imported foods are cheaper in Lagos because of the ports. But imported foods are not cheap in the north because of the cost of logistics to transport it to the north. And because Nigeria doesn't have a functional cargo rail system to move foods. Foods grown in Nigeria is cheaper in the north because it's grown mostly in Nigeria in the north. But food grown in Nigeria is not cheap in Lagos because most of it is transported to Lagos, and Lagos has a landmass, the smallest landmass in Nigeria, on 30,527 square kilometers. So farming is not exactly his selling point. So how are you, assessing the people who came and said that food prices have gone down? What spread of survey did you do to confirm that food prices are actually going down? Because Nigerians are going through the ringer. GDP per capita, the GDP was rebased to $230 billion from $188 billion. But when you look at the GDP per capita on the purchasing price parity basis, Nigerians are not doing very well. So this is a question we need to ask, because the integrity of the data, is what will help decision making. And when the data is lopsided because of undue political pressure, then they will make decisions that are not exactly accurate. And the fact that Cardozo and his team are only confident to reduce it by 50 basis points because there's been a lot of pressure from people saying, the MBS is reporting inflation is going down, why are you not adjusting the interest rates? It shows you that they don't actually believe those numbers, because if they do, they'll be cutting by anywhere around 300 to 500 basis points.
Mr. Emmanuel, I like the fact that your opening thoughts had to capture the issues around the MBS and the political undertone, because somewhere in the U.S. as well, there's that back and forth between U.S. President Mr. Donald Trump and the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jeremy Powell, who is also an investor and bank and lawyer. So I like the fact that your opening thoughts had to capture that. I was going to ask you about that, if perhaps as we begin to count down to 2027, if these numbers and the big decisions are politically motivated. But let me just go straight and ask you something else, because I know that the Fed chair, the U.S. Fed chair, Jeremy Powell, had also hinted on the need to cut interest rates in the U.S. So I'm just also wondering, are we just doing copy and paste here? Because we're very good at that. The U.S. does presidential system of government, we copy. Tomorrow it's a parliamentary system of government, and then we copy as well. So is it just a copy and paste system there that we are doing as well?
Well, the U.S. Federal Reserve, thank you for asking this question, and good morning to you. The U.S. has the largest economy in the world, so they've always given forward guidance to all the other central banks around the world, the Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, the Reserve Bank of Russia, the Reserve Bank of India, and the likes of them. They've always given forward guidance. But usually when you cut the FOMC rate, Federal Open Market Committee rate in America, there's a flow of capital to frontier and emerging markets. But when you increase it, there's the flow of capital to safe havens like the US, because Treasury yields appreciate, and investors prefer the safe haven, like the classifieds. But if you look at the spark between Donald Trump and Chair Jeremy Powell, and you see the fact that recently Trump tried removing one of the Federal Reserve board governors, and she went to court, and the appeal struck down the decision of the U.S. president and reinstated her because the U.S. president doesn't have the authority to remove a governor or like the central bank chair unless there is a process that is gone through and the Senate two-thirds vote approval from the U.S. Congress approving or ratifying that decision, which has not been done. You see, the decisions on monetary policy are so sensitive that it doesn't care about political posturing or how your government looks. The numbers are the numbers. You have to make decisions based on cold, hard data. So what Trump is attempting to do in America by saying that, despite the fact that inflation is higher than it was when he came into office because of the decisions on tariff and all the geopolitical instability of having energy prices that you currently have, the fact that Russia, Nord Stream 1 and 2 is out of service, Europe is not getting gas, and prices of energy is ramping up. You can't force interest rates down because you want your government to look good when inflation is up. It doesn't work that way. If you focus on the drivers and you decelerate inflation, then the central bank will automatically respond. And this is my point exactly about Nigeria. I don't see the heavy lifting. Yes, there's been improvements, some level of stability upstream in terms of production. Nigeria has finally been able to reach OPEC quota, and now the discussion has gone from how do we raise the technical allowance rates to increase how much barrels we pump to surface on a daily basis. How do we get OPEC to increase our quota by another 30 to 400,000 barrels per day, or how do we decouple OPEC quota from our strategic petroleum reserve stock for domestic refineries in Nigeria, to get more dollars that are outside of the wholesale agreements the government currently has. Government has about 300,000 barrels committed to loans that are taking that pays on a daily basis. And if you look at the daily crude allocation, there isn't so much free barrels out of about 820,000 barrels that belong to the government that it can use to get USD liquidity to be able to, raise the balance of payment for net external reserves. And the CBN has done some work in terms of trying to see if it can raise the diaspora remittances and also to raise the net export proceeds it gets for companies who export to bring their dollars back to the originating bank for the CBN to do balance of payments and for the FX markets to be liquid, So, look, the government needs to understand that reform takes a process, and the danger is in trying to look good before the 2027 elections, the government might end up forcing pressure on presenting numbers that do not reflect reality and making the central bank to make mistakes and undo the progress we're currently making. So this is my point exactly. So the numbers do not have feelings. Numbers are the numbers. The numbers are unemotional. The government needs to do what it needs to do to make sure that the levers of macroeconomic data looks good so that the Monetary Policy Committee will respond accordingly.
Mr. Manuel, I'm not sure how much of a football lover or follower you are, but I know that football managers employ formations 4-2-2, 4-4-2, 4-3-3, 4-2-3-1. So this, when you look at these economic reforms and the style and this idea of a capitalist system of government and economy, I wonder if you think it does suit Nigeria, the peculiarities of Nigeria.
So that's a very good timely question you asked. You see, socialist system has not really worked because in the socialist system you pegged the interest rates. I'll give you an example. Dangote, for example, placed FX forwards for about $250 million to $300 million at 390. It was supposed to be a T90 transaction, which means the transaction was supposed to be settled within 90 days. And the rates went up to about 1,900 within the period. It wasn't settled for more than 3 years. and then overdraft charges were accumulated in billions of naira, and several other manufacturing companies that placed forwards amounting to about $2 billion that has been returned with serious losses in overdraft charges because of the swap between the naira that is accumulating interest rates and the dollar that was lended to them by their banks to settle those obligations. You see, the socialist system we have in Nigeria, right, does not work because you can't have a situation where the economy is based on a capitalist structure and the government is taking taxes and government-owned enterprise revenues to subsidize petrol, subsidize FX, subsidize electricity, and the government is not raising as much revenues as fast as it should raise it to, be able to solve these social demands. And then it has to borrow, which was the foundation of the crisis we got into in the first place, because between power subsidy, FX subsidy, and petrol subsidy, you're spending about 13 trillion naira on a yearly basis, right? And then because the government could not raise enough revenues to cover these demands, it ended up having to borrow from the central bank and printing money it didn't have. The currency depreciated, inflation went up. This was the cause of this whole crisis we're in today. So if you create a socialist system, you have to have the money to be able to fund it. If you don't have the money to fund it, you can't borrow to fund the socialist economy, right? Which is the reason why I'm saying that the reforms are in the right direction. But the president and his team, they need to show goodwill to the people by being prudent and financially responsible, so that when they're telling people to be patient and sacrifice, they are not telling the people, do as I say and don't do as I do.
Speaking of
this is the moral hazard.
And speaking of the reforms being in the right direction, the MPC's decisions, and they also told us yesterday, by the way, that the foreign reserve has grown to $43 billion. And some are asking why we need to borrow. Last week, the Guardian was telling us about money illusion fueling fiscal crisis. Do you see an alignment between the monetary policy and the fiscal policy for economic stability?
So, it's interesting because usually budgets have revenue and debt components. But the question is, I believe that the government should be generating more revenues than it's currently generating. That's why, if you notice very well, I've been very focused on the oil and gas sector, and because I think that's the lowest hanging fruit for generating revenues, and the FX liquidity, you need to stabilize the FX markets. I think the naira is undervalued by about 28 to 29%. And the true north of the naira is anywhere around 1,100 to 1,150 naira to a US dollar. But that will not happen unless, you have significant deposit in your net external reserve that is not encumbered by swaps and forwards, and you can supply enough liquidity to cover the non-deliverable forwards market. See, you have about $28 billion that are held by Nigerians in the banking system today onshore for speculative reasons. The reason why they're holding that much liquidity is because you don't have, one, a functional forwards market and a very liquid foreign exchange market. So if, for example, in 6 months, my company, for example, I'm just giving hypotheticals, is supposed to import maybe $2 million worth of goods from China. The question I should be asking as a businessman is, what assurance do I have that in 6 months' time, the FX rate is going to stay the same and it's not going to move to 1,750 or 1,600? That's the question. No, so because of that lack of clarity and assurance, people buy FX upfront, keep in their banks, and sometimes the smart ones do some kind of transactions with the bank, and then they pay them interest on that money on the short term until they need the money. All of that liquidity, affects the exchange rate. For you to, have a situation where Nigerians are comfortable holding their naira until they need it, or a situation where they can easily go to their bank and buy a premium, with 5 or 10% of the monies they need, and then be sure that when they actually need the money for the transaction, the banks will deliver the money for them. You need liquidity in the FX markets, right? If you don't have that liquidity, you're going to have a situation where, people will keep speculating and holding money, so much money onshore that will affect the naira to dollar exchange rate and affect all other metrics of the economy, because exchange rate has a huge impact on inflation.
It sounds like a mixed bag there with more of the downsides than the positives. But clearly it's an ongoing conversation and we must anchor it at this point. Always a delight to have you, Mr. Kelvin Emmanuel, an economist who has joined us on this one. Thank you for having me. And there's more to come on the program. This time we'll touch on the downstream sector as regards, this brewing conflict between marketers. Stay with us for this one. We'll be right back.